Number 10. Persistence hunting. They ran down animals that could outsprint them in seconds, and won by making the chase last until the prey's own body temperature killed it. They were not fast, they were not armed with claws, they were not built for ambush, and yet on the open savanna they became the most relentless pursuit predator the continent had ever produced. The tactic was brutal in its simplicity: pick a target and do not stop running. The hunts began in the Kalahari and stretched across the East African Rift, somewhere between 100,000 and 2 million years ago. The evidence is still being argued over, but the traces in bone chemistry and fossil footprints point deep into the Pleistocene. A small band would select an antelope, separate it from the herd, and begin to follow. Not sprint, follow. The antelope would bolt, vanish over the horizon, and the hunters would jog behind at a steady, unspectacular pace. The sun climbed, the air thickened. Then, hours later, they found it again. How did they track an animal that had disappeared from sight? They read the sand: a displaced pebble, a bent grass stem, a faint depression in the dirt where a hoof had landed at full speed. How did they keep going in midday heat that would kill most mammals? They sweat. They lost heat through bare skin, while every quadruped on the savanna was forced to stop and pant. And an animal that stops to pant in the midday sun cannot also run. The prey's body temperature climbed past 40 degrees Celsius. Then past 41. The hunters stayed cool, the gap closed. Some researchers call this the endurance running hypothesis and frame it as an evolutionary adaptation tied to bipedalism. Others argue it was a marginal strategy, used only when plant food was scarce. A few point to the sand people of the Kalahari, who still practice persistence hunting into the 20th century, as proof it worked, but also as proof of how rarely it was worth the caloric cost. None of these frameworks fully account for what the chase demanded: not just a body built to run, but a mind willing to keep going when every signal from the muscles said to stop. The antelope would finally stagger. Its legs would buckle. It would drop onto its side in the dust, alive but unable to move, its internal organs beginning to cook from the heat it could not shed. The hunters would arrive, still standing, still breathing, and finish it with a stone or a thrust to the throat. The animal had died not from a wound, but from the inside out. And the humans who killed it had learned something no other predator on the savanna ever would: that patience, in the right conditions, is indistinguishable from a weapon. Running prey down took hours, but there was a faster way to get meat, and it meant walking toward the thing with the teeth instead of away from it. At number 9. Active kill hijacking. A band of hominins, armed with nothing but noise, walked up to a fresh lion kill, and the lion left. If you want to see where this goes, hit subscribe. The deepest one is still ahead. No spears, no fire, no size advantage. A handful of hominins, each standing barely 5 feet tall, approached a predator that could crush a skull in one bite, and they did it on purpose. The evidence is etched into fossil assemblages across East Africa, tooth marks from large carnivores on the same bones that later show cut marks from stone tools. The hominins arrived after the kill, but before the carcass was finished. The scene played out on open grassland near water holes at the edges of woodlands. A lion or a saber-toothed cat would bring down a zebra or a wildebeest. The animal would still be breathing when the first hominins appeared at the tree line. They would gather. They would start shouting, not words, not language as we know it, but a wall of coordinated noise. Arms raised, stones thrown. The sheer strangeness of the display was the weapon. Noise. No other animal on the savanna behaved this way. A threat that was loud but physically inferior was an evolutionary puzzle. Predators had no script for a creature that refused to either flee or fight on honest terms. The lions hesitated. That hesitation was enough. A lion that has just made a kill has already spent enormous energy and faces a simple calculus: defend the carcass against an unpredictable mob, or walk away and hunt again. Often, they walk. And in that gap, between the predator's retreat and the cooling body, Early humans carved out a niche that should not have existed. Some paleoanthropologists argue that hominins were pure scavengers, arriving only after predators had fully abandoned a carcass. Others suggest they watched from a distance and timed their approach carefully. A growing camp believes the mobbing was active and deliberate, a coordinated bluff, but none of these models fully explain the confidence it required. One miscalculation, one lion that chose not to leave, and the entire strategy collapsed into catastrophe. The kill was taken, the best cuts were hauled away. What the hominins could not carry, the sun claimed. What the sun did not claim, the hyenas found by nightfall. And the lions simply moved on because the grassland was vast and there was always another animal to catch. But the humans had learned something from the exchange, something that would outlast every predator on the savanna, that the world's most dangerous animals could be made to yield not by force, but by the refusal to back down. Stealing a kill was dangerous, but at least the meat was on the outside. What was left on the bones, what no jaw could reach, would become the difference between a tribe that lasted the winter and one that didn't. And this one, strange as it is not yet the strangest, not even close. Down to number 8. Bone marrow scavenging. Long after the predators and the vultures had taken everything, early humans found the one thing no other animal could reach, by smashing it open with rocks. No teeth could crack a giraffe's femur. No hyena's jaw could reach the center of an elephant's tibia. The marrow, the dense, fat-rich, calorie-dense tissue locked inside the longest bones, was sealed behind walls of calcium that no predator on the continent could breach. Every carnivore walked away from it. Every scavenger left it behind. The marrow sat inside the bone like something buried on purpose, waiting for the one species that would figure out how to open it. The evidence comes from sites like Swartkrans in South Africa, dating to roughly 1.8 million years ago. Excavations there have revealed hammerstone marks on long bone fragments, the distinctive pitting and percussion scars left when a stone is brought down hard on bone. The bones weren't just cracked, they were systematically shattered. The fragments show they were not simply breaking bones open, they were reducing them to pieces small enough to extract every last trace of the fat inside. The stones used were not specialized tools. They were river cobbles picked up, swung, and discarded. Picture it. A hominin crouched over a shattered femur in the dust, fingers prying loose the soft, glistening tissue from the shaft, while a hyena watched from the brush, unable to do what this small, weak animal had just done. Why marrow? Because on the Pleistocene savanna, fat was not a dietary luxury. It was survival currency. Lean meat alone could not sustain a growing brain. The human brain consumes roughly 20% of the body's energy while making up only 2% of its mass. Without dense caloric inputs, the organ simply does not develop. How did a species with such an expensive brain fuel it in a landscape where food was seasonal and unpredictable? They ate what nothing else could reach. How did they reach it? They used rocks. How did they know the rocks would work? That part, the moment of first discovery, is gone. Some archaeologists argue that marrow access was incidental, that hominins cracked bones open while scavenging and simply noticed the food inside. Others contend it was deliberate and habitual, pointing to the sheer volume of fractured bones at early hominin sites. A minority position holds that the behavior was socially transmitted, taught, not discovered independently, which would make marrow extraction one of the earliest forms of cultural knowledge. None of these theories account for the persistence it required. This was not a shortcut. It was labor, exhausting, repetitive. Knuckle-splitting labor, for a reward measured in ounces. The bones are still there, in the ground, in museum drawers, in the fossil record, shattered by hands that learned before language, before fire, before almost everything we consider human, that the world keeps its best food locked away, and that a stone, swung hard enough, is a kind of key. Marrow kept them alive through cold months, but food was never just food. The plants they foraged were laced with toxins, and the solution was buried under their feet. Coming in at number 7. Geophagy. They ate clay, not by accident, not out of desperation, because their bodies had learned that certain earth could neutralize poisons that would otherwise kill them. It was not hunger. It was not pica, the disordered craving for non-food substances. It was strategy. Across the prehistoric world, humans and their ancestors picked up specific types of earth and swallowed them. Not gravel, not sand, not random dirt. Clay, particular clays, rich in kaolin and smectite, the same compound still used in modern anti-diarrheal medicine. They chose it with precision, born from generations of observation. The practice left traces in the archaeological record that are easy to miss if you don't know what to look for: concentrated deposits of specific clay minerals in cave sediments, far from any natural geological source. Someone carried that earth inside. Someone ate it. In modern hunter-gatherer communities that still practice geophagy, the Himba of Namibia, the Toba of Argentina, the clay is harvested from exposed riverbanks, rolled into small pellets, and consumed alongside meals. The texture is smooth, almost greasy on the tongue. The taste is mineral and flat. Then, thousands of years before the first pharmacy, they already knew. The wild plants available to prehistoric foragers were not the domesticated, toxin-free varieties found in modern grocery stores. Many tubers, leaves, and seeds contained alkaloids and tannins at concentrations high enough to cause kidney failure, paralysis, or death. The clay worked because its mineral structure binds to these toxins in the gut, preventing absorption. It was not a cure. It was a filter, a physical barrier between a toxic food supply and a vulnerable digestive system. And its use implies something uncomfortable: that early humans were eating poisonous plants regularly enough that their bodies learned to compensate, which means the line between foraging and poisoning was one they walked every day. Some anthropologists classify geophagy as a nutritional supplement. The clay provides calcium, iron, and zinc in environments where those minerals are scarce. Others treat it as a detoxification mechanism, pointing to the binding properties of the clay minerals themselves. A third camp argues it served both functions simultaneously, making it one of the earliest known examples of multi-purpose tool use, except the tool was consumed. What none of these models explain is the specificity. The humans who practiced geophagy did not eat just any earth. They selected particular deposits, sometimes traveling significant distances to reach them, which means the knowledge of which earth to eat and which would kill you was transmitted, remembered, and protected. The toxins were absorbed, the clay was passed, the body survived another meal, but the knowledge of which earth to swallow, that had to be taught, and whoever taught it first is gone. Their name, their face, their voice, all gone. Only the habit remains, still being practiced in places where the old knowledge has not yet been replaced by something newer. Eating the right earth could save you from poison, but poison wasn't the only thing that killed silently. In the dry seasons, thirst came first, and the answer required thinking months ahead. Number 6. Ostrich eggshell water storage. They filled ostrich eggs with water, sealed them, and buried them along migration routes, creating supply lines across deserts where a single missed water source meant death. The ostrich egg is a biomechanical absurdity. It holds roughly 1 liter of liquid, weighs close to 1.5 kilograms when full, and its shell is thick enough to support the weight of a grown human standing on it without cracking. For a predator, it is a meal. For a prehistoric nomad crossing the arid corridors of southern Africa, it was something far more valuable: a container that already existed in the landscape, required no manufacturing, and could be sealed with nothing more than a handful of grass and a daub of clay. The archaeological record from sites in the Gap Escarpment and the Kalahari Basin, dating back at least 60,000 years, possibly far older, reveals ostrich eggshell fragments drilled with small, clean openings at one end. Not broken, drilled. The precision of the holes suggests a tool was used, a stone flake or a sharpened bone, to puncture the shell just wide enough to drain the contents and refill it with water. Some fragments carry traces of beeswax or plant resin along the rim, the residue of ancient sealants. Others show wear patterns consistent with being carried in a sling or a net, bouncing against a walker's hip for hundreds of kilometers. They buried them, not randomly, along known routes between seasonal water sources, routes that had been walked so many times the landscape itself had become a calendar. A water-filled egg, sealed and buried in the sand at a marked location, could remain cool and drinkable for weeks. In a region where the distance between reliable springs could exceed 100 kilometers, and where a single dry season could wipe out an entire band, these buried eggs were not a convenience. They were the margin between arrival and extinction. And they required something that no other survival tactic on this list demanded: the ability to imagine a future self, thirsty, standing in a place you had not yet reached, and to act on that image now. Some researchers classify this as simple caching, no different from a squirrel burying nuts. Others argue that the geographic precision, the sealant technology, and the route-specific placement elevate it to something closer to infrastructure. A minority view holds that the knowledge of where each egg was buried was itself a form of inherited wealth, passed from one generation to the next as verbal maps, the earliest known supply chains. None of these positions fully confront what the practice implies: that humans were planning for scarcity before it arrived, which means they had learned to distrust the present. The eggs are still found, occasionally intact, still holding the mineral scent of ancient water, sealed inside calcium that has not breathed in 10,000 years. The people who buried them moved on or did not survive to retrieve them. The water is gone. The shells remain empty and perfect in the sand. Planning for thirst took foresight, but some threats didn't announce themselves from the horizon. They came in through the cracks in the rock, tiny, silent, and lethal. Everything so far has been the shallow water. From here on, the floor drops out. At number 5, fumigation pest control. They burned green vegetation inside their shelters, releasing smoke thick enough to drive out insects carrying diseases that could wipe out an entire band overnight. A cave in South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal province, occupied roughly 70,000 years ago, yielded a sediment layer unlike anything around it. A concentrated band of ash mixed with the charred remains of green plant material, leaves, stems, and aromatic herbs that do not grow naturally inside caves. The ash was not from cooking fires. Cooking fires burn dry wood. Green vegetation produces something else entirely: a dense, acrid, low-hanging smoke that clings to walls and fills every crevice before slowly rising. It irritates the eyes. It coats the respiratory system. And for the insects that carry malaria, leishmaniasis, and tick-borne relapsing fever, it is unlivable. The shelters varied: rock overhangs, shallow caves, brush huts, but the threat was the same. Mosquitoes, sandflies, and ticks breed in the warm, stagnant corners of any enclosed space where humans sleep. A single infected mosquito can transmit a parasite that kills a child in days. A tick colony in a sleeping area can spread relapsing fever through an entire band before the first symptom appears. On the Pleistocene landscape, there was no medicine, no recovery, no second chance. Prevention was the only cure. So they burned. Not dry wood, which burns clean and fast and produces the kind of smoke that rises and dissipates. Green vegetation, freshly cut, still full of moisture, smolders. It fills the shelter from the floor up, pushing into the cracks where insects hide and breed, driving them out through any gap or killing them where they cluster. Some of the plant species identified in the ash layers, wild sage, certain euphorbias, produce compounds that are mildly toxic to insects even when the smoke has thinned. The people who gathered these plants may not have known the word pesticide, but they had learned, through whatever chain of observation and loss, that a shelter filled with this particular smoke was a shelter where fewer people got sick. Some archaeologists view the burning as incidental, the residue of cooking or warmth, with the insect-repelling effect as an accidental bonus. Others argue that the specific selection of green, aromatic plants points to deliberate fumigation, citing the absence of any cooking-related debris in the same layers. A third position, grounded in ethnographic parallels with modern hunter-gatherer groups who still fumigate their shelters, treats the practice as a form of environmental medicine, treating the space, not the body, as the patient. But none of these frameworks account for the cost. Green vegetation is heavy. Carrying armloads of fresh herbs into a shelter means time spent not hunting, not foraging, not sleeping. The people who did this were trading calories for safety, which means they had calculated that the insects were more dangerous than the hunger. The smoke cleared. The insects fled or died. The band breathed air that burned their throats but left their blood clean. And by morning, the shelter was tolerable again, until the next night brought the next swarm, and the next fire was lit, and the next layer of ash settled where their children slept. Smoke could clear a shelter, but outside, the savanna was full of eyes, and the only way to read them was to watch what the birds were watching. Number 4. Predator tracking via bird behavior. They read the sky. Vulture descents, alarm calls, circling patterns, each one a signal that meant the difference between finding food and avoiding becoming it. A vulture circling low over the acacia scrub does not mean food to a prehistoric human. It means a decision. Something has died or something is dying, and the bird's flight pattern reveals which one and where. A single vulture climbing in a thermal is scanning. A group descending in a tight spiral has spotted a carcass. A vulture sitting on the ground with its wings spread is not feeding. It is waiting, which means something else is still eating, which means a predator is near. The sky was a language, and early humans could read it before they could speak one of their own. The behavior is documented across the African savanna and the Mediterranean basin, stretching back at least 200,000 years. The evidence drawn from modern observations of hunter-gatherer groups and the ecological overlap between hominin sites and vulture habitats. The Hadza of Tanzania still track vultures to find carcasses. The San of the Kalahari interpret alarm calls from oxpeckers and francolins to locate both predators and prey. These are not learned as isolated facts. They are absorbed across a lifetime of watching the sky respond to the ground. But the system had a second layer. Alarm calls from smaller birds, bulbuls, drongos, hornbills, function as a distributed warning network across the canopy. A raptor overhead triggers one kind of call. A snake in the branches triggers another. A leopard moving through the undergrowth triggers a third. How did early humans tell them apart? They listened. How did they know which call meant danger and which meant opportunity? They remembered. How did they verify? They watched what other animals did in response. A feeding antelope lifting its head, a troop of baboons shifting direction, a herd of impala suddenly facing the same way. And this one, strange as it is not yet the strangest, not even close. Some researchers argue that tracking bird behavior was opportunistic, noticed and exploited when convenient, but not relied upon. Others contend it was systematic, citing the evolutionary advantage of reading aerial signals in a terrain where ground-level visibility is often limited to a few meters. A growing body of work suggests hominins may have actively followed vulture columns to locate carcasses before other scavengers arrive, turning the sky into a reconnaissance system. But none of these models capture what the habit cost in attention. Every minute spent watching the sky was a minute not spent watching the ground. The humans who relied on bird behavior were dividing their awareness between two worlds and betting their survival on what they saw in the one above. The vultures are still there, still circling, still descending in tight spirals over things that have stopped moving. The people who learned to read them are still there too, in some places, still looking up before they look ahead, still trusting a bird they have never touched to tell them what the grassland is hiding. Reading the sky gave them distance. But there were places where even eyes and birds were useless, underground in the dark, where sound was the only tool left. Moving down to number 3. Acoustic cave communication. Deep inside caves where no light reached, they used echoes, clapping, stamping, singing, to map passages and signal distant tribal bands. A hand clap in a cave is not just a sound. It is a question asked of the rock. The echo returns with information: the distance to the far wall, the width of the passage, the presence of a junction or a dead end. A stamp on the cave floor sends a low-frequency pulse through stone that bounces off surfaces the ear cannot see and returns as a shape. Not a visual shape, but a spatial one, felt more than heard. In the deep chambers of caves in southern France, northern Spain, and the Urals, some occupied as early as 40,000 years ago, researchers have found evidence that Paleolithic humans used sound deliberately to navigate and communicate in spaces where vision was useless. The evidence is acoustic, not visual. Some cave chambers contain resonant frequencies that amplify human vocalizations. A whisper in the right spot carries to the far end of a 100-meter passage. Others contain what acousticians call dead zones, spaces where sound is absorbed and nothing returns. A team of researchers from the University of Torino, mapping the acoustics of Upper Paleolithic cave sites, discovered that the areas with the highest resonance, the places where sound travels farthest and clearest, corresponded precisely to the areas where cave paintings and hand stencils were concentrated. The art was not placed where it could be seen. It was placed where it could be heard. They were not exploring, they were inhabiting. Caves were shelters, but they were also transit routes between valleys, refuges during weather events, and meeting points for bands that otherwise ranged across separate territories. In a landscape where surface travel was exposed and dangerous, underground passages offered protection, but only if you could find your way through them. The acoustic maps were not drawn on walls. They were carried in memory, the specific echo of a particular junction, the way a certain chamber amplified a low hum, the dead zone that meant a tunnel was about to narrow. How did they learn this? They listened. How did they teach it? They sang, placing sounds in specific locations so that others could hear the architecture of the cave around them. Some researchers argue the acoustic properties were incidental, that early humans preferred deep chambers for ritual purposes, and the sound was a byproduct. Others contend the relationship was deliberate, pointing to the correlation between resonance and art placement as evidence of intentional acoustic design. A third position suggests some Paleolithic humans may have developed click-based navigation, the same principle as bats, but at human frequencies and human speeds. But none of these interpretations addresses the loneliness of it. To stand in a cave chamber in absolute darkness and send a sound into the rock and wait for an answer is to be alone in a way that no surface landscape can replicate. The echoes return. The walls are still there. The chambers still amplify a voice at the right frequency, carrying it through stone corridors to ears that have not yet arrived. The people who mapped these caves by sound left no written records. They left paintings placed where the sound lived, as if the image and the echo were the same thing, as if the shape of a bison on a wall was also the shape of a voice returning through the dark. Sound could carry through stone, but some threats were already inside the body, silent, feeding, and untouchable by any echo. The only way to reach them was to swallow something worse. At number 2, self-medication. They swallowed bitter, toxic plants on purpose, not for food, but to purge the parasites eating them from the inside, trading one kind of poison for another. The body knows when something is wrong. Nausea, cramping, fever, these are not diseases, they are alarms. And somewhere in the deep prehistoric past, humans learned to answer those alarms with a second poison, one chosen not because it was safe, but because it was worse for the thing inside them than it was for them. The plants were not food. They were not pleasant. They were bitter, astringent, sometimes hallucinogenic, always harsh on the stomach lining. and they were swallowed deliberately, in small, measured doses, because the alternative was letting the parasites finish what they had started. The evidence comes from several directions. Coprolite analysis, the study of fossilized feces from sites in the Americas and Africa, has revealed the eggs of intestinal parasites alongside plant residues of species known for their vermifuge properties: wormhood, tansy, certain species of Artemisia. Neanderthal dental calculus from El Cedron in Spain, dated to roughly 49,000 years ago, contains traces of yarrow and chamomile plants with no nutritional value, strong bitter flavors, and well-documented antiparasitic effects. They were not eating these plants for calories. They were eating them because something inside them needed to die. The parasites were relentless. Tapeworms, hookworms, pinworms, liver flukes, each one adapted to spend its adult life inside a human host, feeding on partially digested food, boring through tissue, laying eggs by the thousands. In a prehistoric population with no plumbing and constant contact with contaminated soil and water, infection was not probable. It was certain. The question was never whether a person carried parasites. It was how many, and whether the body could tolerate them long enough to reproduce before the worms won. So they treated themselves, not with insight no early human understood the life cycle of a tapeworm, but with pattern recognition. Last time I ate this plant, the thing in my stool moved. Last time I chewed these leaves, the pain shifted. The dose was the difference between medicine and poison. Too much yarrow could cause liver damage. Too much wormhood could trigger seizures. The knowledge of how much was enough was not written down. It was held in the memory of the person who had survived taking it, and passed to the next person who needed it, in a chain of trust that stretched back tens of thousands of years before the first written prescription. Some researchers frame this as instinctive behavior, no different from a chimpanzee swallowing rough leaves to scour parasites from its intestines. Others argue that the specificity of the plants selected and the evidence of dose regulation suggest a cognitive leap beyond instinct. The recognition that a substance can be both harmful and helpful depending on how and when it is used. A third position holds that self-medication was the beginning of medicine itself, the first step on a road that leads, through countless generations of trial and error, to the pharmaceutical industry. But none of these frameworks sit comfortably with what the practice actually required: the willingness to make yourself sicker, temporarily, in the hope of becoming less sick. That is not instinct. That is a gamble, taken by a mind that understood, however dimly, that the body it lived in was under attack from something it could not see. The parasites are still with us. So are the plants. Wormhood still grows along the same riverbanks. Yarrow still flowers in the same meadows. The difference is that now we have words for what the plants do and names for what they kill. Then there were only the symptoms, the taste, and the long night of waiting to see whether the poison you swallowed was stronger than the one already inside you. Poisoning the body to save it was the most intimate survival tactic they had. But the most unsettling one wasn't about what they did to themselves. It was about who they trusted to warn them. Number 1, the one you came for. Cross-species alarm exploitation. They did not just listen to other species. They depended on them. Monkey alarm calls, deer stampedes, bird warnings, prehistoric humans survived by treating the entire ecosystem as a single extended alarm system they were wired into but did not control. A Samango monkey screaming in the canopy is not talking to you. It is talking to other Samango monkeys. The call is specific, a short staccato burst for a snake, a longer descending tone for an eagle, a sharp repeated bark for a leopard. Each one triggers a different response in the troop: climb higher, freeze, scatter. The monkey does not care whether you live or die. It does not know you are listening. And yet, for hundreds of thousands of years, your survival depended on the fact that you were. The principle is simple, and it is devastating. Every prey animal on the savannah is constantly monitoring for threats. A duiker snorts and bolts. A francolin erupts from the brush with a warning cry. A troop of baboons shifts direction as a single body, their barking concentrating on a single point in the undergrowth. Each of these signals is produced by an animal that has evolved to detect predators faster than any human could because its life depends on it. The human who learns to read these signals is not using a tool. They are borrowing another species' senses, tapping into a surveillance network that covers the entire landscape at no caloric cost. The evidence is scattered and indirect. There are no fossilized alarm calls, but the behavioral traces are overwhelming. Modern hunter-gatherer groups across 3 continents interpret cross-species alarm signals as a matter of routine. The F of the Itchery forest trackdiker alarm calls to avoid leopards. The Hadza follow honey guide birds to locate bee colonies. The Ache of Paraguay interpret the alarm calls of toucans, and jacamars to identify the approach of jaguars. These are not occasional tricks. They are daily practice, woven so deeply into the rhythm of survival that they are rarely even named as a separate skill. They are simply how one moves through a landscape full of things that want to kill you. But the dependency runs deeper than information. Prehistoric humans did not merely listen to other species. They structured their movements around them. A band approaching a waterhole at dawn would pause and watch the animals already there, not to hunt them but to read them. If the impala were drinking calmly, the waterhole was probably safe. If they were nervous, glancing repeatedly at the same stretch of reeds, something was watching from the reeds. The humans did not control this system. They did not create it. They could not modify it. They could only listen and trust that the animals whose lives depended on detecting danger were better at detecting it than they were. Some ecologists classify this as commensalism, a one-way benefit with no cost to the signaling species. Others argue it approaches mutualism, noting that human presence on the landscape can itself function as an alarm signal for other prey animals, creating a loose, reciprocal network. A minority position suggests that early humans' reliance on cross-species alarms was so complete that it constituted a form of sensory outsourcing, the delegation of threat detection to non-human agents, making the boundary between self and environment far less clear than we prefer to believe. We do not know when this dependence began. We do not know which alarm call was the first one a hominin understood. We do not know whether the knowledge was instinctive or learned, only that it was indispensable. The forests still scream. The savannas still carry the bark of a baboon pointing at something in the grass. The birds still take flight in patterns that mean nothing to most people walking beneath them. But for the vast majority of human history, those sounds were not background noise. They were the reason you woke up in the morning and the reason you woke up at all. On the island of Flores, in a cave called Liang Bua, archaeologists found stone tools alongside the bones of a tiny hominin Homo floresiensis, standing barely 3.5 feet tall, with a brain the size of a chimpanzee's. The tools were sophisticated. The hunting strategies were complex, and no one can explain how a species that small, with a brain that small, survived on an island full of giant storks and Komodo dragons for 700,000 years. Something was keeping them alive. We still don't know what.